What are the pagan roots of Santa Claus? I would guess that most people have probably heard of the Catholic saint Nicholas, or his Dutch characterization in Sinterklaas, whose white beard and priestly cardinal red coat evolved into the American Santa Claus we know in the West today. And I would guess that slightly fewer people have heard of the Protestant Christkind, the baby Jesus gift giver, who later evolved into the folk hero Kris Kringle, using the carpentry skills of Jesus to make toys for children. I could have decided to deep dive into the pagan roots of Catholic saints and holidays, but there are plenty of other videos that go there. And frankly, I'm not too interested in Christian themes anyway. I would rather explore timeless pagan archetypes and motifs that find themselves subtly echoed in modern folklore. Father Christmas is perhaps the most popular pagan archetype remaining. It's easier to see the Dionysian and Bacchic influences of his jolly and transient character. And in The Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, it is also possible to see Apollonian, Luciferian, and even Saturnian themes. This makes it a pretty solid modern myth, even from a non-Christian perspective. That's why I've decided to do a separate video on The Christmas Carol after New Year's, featuring the three ghosts of Christmas. For now, let's focus on Santa. Remember that scene from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Santa Claus gifts children with weapons of war? Yeah. It'll actually make perfect sense in a moment. Various legends mention smithing gods who provide aspiring heroes with divinely crafted weapons. Perkusha crafted a mace and bow for Kapala in Georgian myth. The dwarf Sudri crafted many gifts, including Mjolnir. Hephaestus provided Zeus with his thunderbolts, and so on. Hephaestus is the Russian translation of Hephaestus, and is syncretized with their own Slavic smithing god, Svarog. Hephaestus is considered the father of Helios, the sun, who in Slavic myth is called Dajbog. And Dajbog is the equivalent of Beldeg in English, Balder and Dag in Norse, Dagda in Celtic, and Daksha in Vedic, among many others. These deities represent the beauty, prosperity, abundance, and fertility of summer, but each of them dies and is ultimately resurrected, like the sun sets and rises every day, or retreats south in winter and returns back in summer. The ancient Egyptians believed that Ra, the sun god, entered the underworld each night, when, to their eyes, he passed over the horizon. The story of Osiris, his son, also mirrors that of Balder, Daksha, and Dajbog, having died and brought to the underworld, then ultimately resurrected and replaced by his son, the new sun, Horus. In many mythologies, every day a new sun is born, and every day that sun ultimately dies. Daksha, the Vedic grandfather of the Hindu gods, is decapitated and resurrected with the head of a goat. Scandinavians and Finns today still practice the remnants of a sacrificial goat ritual, likely referring to the sign of Capricorn, which begins on the winter solstice. They craft Yule goat effigies and offerings which are meant to be burned. The Finnish Santa Claus, Joulupukki, or Yule goat, rides a goat instead of a sleigh. Anyway, why would this dying and resurrecting sun god's father be a smith? I think the Finno-Ugric smithing god Ilmari gives us the best picture. Ilmari and Svarog are credited not only with the crafting of the sun, like a precious jewel, but with the crafting of the sky too, which was thought to be a great mountain. This, perhaps, is why the planets, the gods, might be perceived as living on a heavenly mountain. If the sky were not a solid object, after all, how can titans like Atlas be said to have held it up? Even in the Bible, God is said to have crafted a firmament between the heavens and the earth, which, by definition, is a solid object. I just want to quickly remind all you flat earthers out there that we're talking about mythology. We're not talking about reality or the physics of the world. We're talking about ideas that people did have and that we're capable of thinking about in a metaphorical and literary sense. We can also see in this divine craftsman the Gnostic concept of demiurge, the true creator of the earth, stars, and planets, whose home is beneath the earth, in Tartarus, the underworld, hell, or in the belly of volcanoes, rather than in the heavens. These motifs align to two deities in my altar oracle deck. Vulcanos is one of them. The other one I will mention soon. Vulcanos is associated with Vulpecula, the cusp between Sagittarius and Capricorn, the very period that we are in right now, which roughly happens between the winter solstice and the new year, and is represented by a fox. The fox represents cunning and trickery, and you're going to see why. If you look at Pelagian Slavic myth, we find Belobog, the light god, equivalent of Dajbog, and his opposite, Chernobog, the dark god, who appears in Disney's Fantasia. Chernobog is depicted like Satan, a chthonic devil with horns. If Belobog, like Dajbog, has both a celestial form, the sun, and a chthonic form, passing through the underworld at night, then Chernobog, with his chthonic form, might have a celestial form, represented by one of the planets. In Greek and Gnostic myth, there is the concept of Aphelion, Apollyon, or Abaddon, who is farthest from the sun, both in the sense of representing the abyss of the underworld and the abyss of space, or the farthest planet from the sun. To the naked eye, that's Saturn, who corresponds to Saturnus, Kronos, and Satan, the horned, satyr-like goat god of Capricorn. But another option is Mars, the midnight star, since it's only visible at night, shining with a red-orange glow. For its color, Mars has long been associated with fire, war, and passion. Another common phenomenon at midnight is shooting stars, or falling stars. Technically, they happen all the time, but are mostly only seen at night. Looking up at the night sky and seeing the bright red Mars followed by streaks of fiery meteors nearby might lead one to assume that Mars was somehow responsible for the meteors. Perhaps he is sending gifts of celestial fire to humankind. This reminds me of Azazel, a fallen angel that's also associated with Mars, and who gifted humankind with weapons of war and taught them how to fight. Coming back to Svarog, he is said to have taken on the form of Rarog, which is kind of like a roc, a hawk-like firebird, which represented the hearth fire of the home, and had a will of its own, kind of like Calcifer in Howl's Moving Castle by Miyazaki. This, I think, is the basis for Prometheus and the Promethean archetypes of the Georgian Armani, Armenian Artavast, and so on. Most of us know the general story of how Prometheus gave fire to humankind and how he was punished for it. But he was a teacher of many things, such as blacksmithing, pottery, lawmaking, and virtue. He was even responsible for creating humankind out of clay in the first place. Upon creating humanity, Prometheus gifted us many virtues, and hid away in a box the vices that he wished to spare us from. It is he who gave Pandora this box of vices, and makes a covenant with her not to open it, lest it would let loose the evils of humankind. You might say this was the inspiration for the Gift of Virtue Clarity deck, which was our first design at Studio Pandemonia. 144 virtues compiled into our very own Pandora's box. Check it out with the link to our online Etsy store in the description. This has got to be the best segue of all time. Next time you're looking for the red nose of Rudolph in the night sky, look to the red planet Mars. Speaking of Rudolph, Rudolph is a reindeer, which is a caribou that had been domesticated by the Sami of northern Finland. Caribou, and the idea of the stag in general, is a very important motif for northern European cultures. Rudolph, the name in German, means famous wolf. And perhaps this just refers to a kind of modern telling of the story in which Rudolph is indeed famous for what he did. But there are many who think that this might harken back to the motif of the Wild Hunt. It is widely argued that Odin is the leader of the Wild Hunt, with his spear riding Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse. And I suppose it's possible that this famous wolf could have been either one of his hunting wolves, or the stag that he is chasing, like in so many other myths. A stag is chased essentially across the world. In the case of the Hungarians, the twin founders of the Hungarians and Huns, respectively, Magor and Hunor, chased the stag from the Ural Mountains down into the Eurasian steppe. Personally, I like to think of Rudolph in relation to coincidental naming with Rudra, Kurunta, and therefore with Cernunnos and the Horned God, which I've talked about a few times before as the wild man god of many pantheons, similar to Pan. Another one of these wild men actually accompanied Dionysus on the adventure to India. Perhaps you can leave some hypotheses in the comments below. Let's talk about Santa's workshop. I mentioned Sudrid the dwarf of Norse myth, who crafted Mjolnir. The dwarves of Norse myth, like those of Tolkien's Middle-earth, are gifted blacksmiths and craftsmen. Even some of the 13 dwarves from The Hobbit were toy makers, and take their inspiration from the 13 Yule lads of Icelandic folklore, who, on the 13 days of Yule, similar to the 12 days of Christmas, sneak into your house one by one and make messes or thieve from you, leaving gifts and hidden shoes on each day. This is one of the inspirations for the chapter in The Hobbit, An Unexpected Party, where, one by one, 13 dwarves enter Bilbo's home and wreak havoc on Bag End. Santa's elves are derived from a mix of Norse Alfar, who are hidden folk, and Celtic fairies, more akin to Smurfs than to, say, the elves of Middle-earth. How can I possibly segue back to the smithing god, you might ask? I'm glad you asked. Keebler. They're elf-like cooks and craftsmen living in a treehouse, yes? Keebler kind of sounds like Kabiri and Kabiro. Kabiro was mother of the Kabiri, who were in other sources called followers of Kybele, a Phrygian fertility goddess of nature. Kybele was once a nut tree, Agdistis, who became her upon having his nuts removed. If Kybele and Kabiro are assumed to be the same, then Kybele and Hephaestus are the parents of the Kabiri twins. They bear some resemblance to the Corybantes and Curetes, 7 armored male dancers and drummers of Kybele, or Rhea. The Minoans worshipped Rhea in place of Kybele, implying that they are synonymous. Could this be Mrs. Claus? I know this is a mad flurry of spurious coincidences, but I'm having fun and that's what really matters. Further, the Greeks often conflated the Corybantes and Curetes with the dactyls, the 10 Minoan smiths in service of Hephaestus, corresponding to our 10 fingers. Our hands and fingers are often credited with making us who we are. The very word man means hand in Latin. The Minoan name of Hephaestus was Velkanos, related to Vulcan, but had more aspects related to Kronos and Saturnus as well, like fertility, fruit orchards, and the New Year. He was said to have partnered with a nameless tree goddess. Perhaps this was Kybele, or Agdistis. Remember the nuts that were removed from Agdistis? Well, they went on to grow into Attis, a fertility god of fruit trees, resurrection, and the New Year. And he became the partner of Kybele, according to Phrygian myth. And the story of his self-castration became a strong basis for the symbolism of the later Roman cult of Mithraism. The death and resurrection of Mithras during the winter solstice was celebrated on December 25th. I can hardly contain the sheer amount of connections my mind is drawing from this, so I'll leave it there for you to think about yourself. So these hordes of craftsmen also produced the automatons, which were metallic men made by Hephaestus and the dactyls to guard his lairs in the volcanoes. They're also somewhat similar to the hecatoncheires, who had 50 heads and 100 arms each. In modern times, they come to represent the proletariat, and labor unions and socialist movements agglomerating together to try to overcome the yoke of tyranny and inequality. In my video on the goddess of the harvest, I referred to the communist icon of the sickle, and it was here with this video that we find the communist icon of the hammer. If you remember which deity Cybele is associated with, and now which deity Vulcan, hephaestus, Svarog, Prometheus are all associated with, I present to you, comrades, Mr. and Mrs. Claus. Thank you for watching this video. It's kind of a new vibe I'm going with. It's a new way of doing things that's supposed to be more efficient with my time. I'll be looking forward to doing part 2 of this video on Father Christmas and the Christmas Carol. I'll see you then. Merry Xmas and Happy New Year.